Okay, so as always, we are recording the session. So if you don't want to be on camera, it's time to leave now. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to stay. We appreciate everybody being here. My name is Alexandra Kleinfeld. I am the co-chair of the ADR practice section together with Ann Dalton. And I am a certified civil and family mediator and a qualified arbitrator. So today we are very pleased to have Jessica Vermaak with us to present for us today. She actually just opened up her own practice for therapy sessions. So if you have any clients who are in need of therapy and family law particularly, so please make sure you refer them to Jessica. She's the founder of Be Blissful LLC. She understands the unique pressures and experiences women face from balancing careers and family life to overcoming societal challenges. She's committed to addressing diverse mental health needs with a special focus on empowering women. She hasn't forgotten about the men and couples out there either, and also provides counseling to those people and the population. Some of her favorite treatment modalities include cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, mindfulness-based therapy, person-centered therapy, solution-focused brief therapy, and strength-based therapy. With over 10 years of experience as a licensed mental health counselor and almost 20 years working in the field, she offers a professional and personable approach to therapy. Jessica received her master's degree in mental health counseling at Nova Southeastern University and has worked at some of the leading treatment centers in South Florida. Dedicated to helping others, she has worked her way from a behavioral health technician to a clinical director and many other positions in between. She has facilitated several treatment centers in obtaining accreditation, and now she's here to help you improve your life. So with that introduction, I'm turning it over to Jessica now. And again, thank you so much for being here, Jessica.
Thank you. I appreciate you inviting me. I'm looking forward to doing this presentation. When Alexandra asked me to do it and gave me the topic, I realized it's a very important topic. I do a lot of couples counseling as well as individual counseling, but it's something that as I was creating the presentation, I found that some of it I shared with some of my clients, and it was great to kind of focus on this and in doing that, be able to create more materials for the couples that I work with and some of the individuals that do have experience with interpersonal violence and domestic violence. I treat a lot of clients who specifically when I used to work in substance use, a lot of them had history of sexual abuse and other forms of trauma. So we'll talk about some of that today. I'm going to share my screen. I do have a presentation. So let me find it real quick. There we go. And I don't know how to make it full screen. Give me 1 second. Anybody know how to get it to play?
We can only see half of your screen. So is there something like play slide or play show?
Yeah, give me 1 second.
Might be something.
Is it bigger now?
It's bigger now, and I'm trying to figure this out myself. If you click on slideshow on the
There
top,
we go. Yep.
And then play. Yes,
Right.
that should work.
All right.
Perfect.
So there we go. I had notes, but for some reason my printer wasn't working, so I'll try to just go off of what I have. But I had a whole bunch of notes on these, and some of the slides you'll find that they have a lot of information, and which is great. And so the notes aren't really necessary. So I just didn't want to read from the slides. So we'll see how it goes. So the topic today is helping the mediator understand interpersonal violence from a counselor's perspective. I'm actually a Florida Supreme Court certified family mediator as of a couple weeks ago. I haven't done my first mediation yet, but I know Alexandra because I actually observed a couple of hers, and I appreciate her help in getting me further in this career. And but yeah, a lot of my experience is in counseling, and so you'll see that perspective in this presentation today. And I hope there's something that you guys are all able to learn today in regards to interpersonal violence. So by the end of this presentation, the goals are to understand what interpersonal violence is and, the different forms of interpersonal violence, recognize the cycle of abuse and common myths about interpersonal violence. We also are going to learn the prevalence and impact on individuals and the community, and kind of figure out what the resources are for survivors so that you can provide them to people who are in need. The topics today are understanding interpersonal violence, psychological and emotional impacts, recognizing the signs of abuse, safe interventions and support. We'll talk about what healthy relationships are, societal and cultural factors, legal and advocacy topics, prevention and education, and then how to support survivors. So our first topic, understanding interpersonal violence. Interpersonal violence refers to violence that occurs between individuals and can take place in various contexts, such as family, romantic relationships, friendships, or between acquaintances and strangers. And it can manifest in multiple forms. So here we have a little picture of what the different forms of interpersonal violence are. We have physical violence, emotional or psychological, sexual, economic and financial, verbal, stalking and harassment, neglect, and spiritual and religious, and cyber violence. So I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but we also have examples of what each type of violence is: physical, hitting, slapping, punching; emotional, threats and manipulations; the concept of gaslighting, which we'll talk about later; sexual assault, rape. There's a lot involved in sexual violence. Economic and financial, withholding money, preventing somebody from working, or controlling their financial decisions. Verbal violence is name calling, insults, threats, that kind of stuff. And then stalking and harassment, following somebody, even excessively texting. We're in a technological generation here where, there's that issue of, cyber stalking and online issues. And then neglect, whether it's familial or caregiving contexts, that involves withholding food, withholding medical care, and withholding emotional support. Spiritual and religious violence is forced conversion, using religious beliefs to justify abuse or preventing somebody from practicing their faith. And then again, cyberbullying, revenge porn, online threats, and doxing. And then, so the types of abuse, a lot of it correlates with, the types of violence. So there's physical, intentional use of physical force that results in injury or harm; emotional and psychological actions or words aimed at harming a person's self-esteem; sexual, anything that is non-consensual sexual contact or behavior; verbal abuse is the use of words to harm, control, or intimidate others; financial and economic abuse is controlling or exploiting someone's financial resources; neglect, failure to provide basic needs and care. So we have, down at the bottom as well, child and elder abuse, which also involve neglect in a lot of cases. Digital and cyber abuse, use of technology to harass, control, or intimidate; spiritual and religious abuse, misuse of spiritual beliefs to manipulate and control others; institutional abuse that occurs within institutions like schools and hospitals; and then down at the bottom, child abuse and elder abuse, physical, emotional, or sexual harm directed at either children or elders. And then, of course, there's some examples similar to the ones that I just spoke about. And domestic violence and how interpersonal violence relate. They're both forms of abuse that occur within personal relationships, but have some distinctions. Domestic violence refers to a pattern of abusive behaviors used to gain or maintain power and control over any member of a household or family, whereas interpersonal violence is a subset of domestic violence that specifically involves abuse between current or former romantic partners, spouses, somebody that you're dating, even somebody that you're living with can be abusive. And it's considered an interpersonal, intimate partner violence rather than just domestic abuse. And IPV includes all of the same forms of abuse that domestic violence does, but focuses closely on just intimate relationships. So also we have, the different forms of domestic violence similar to, violence and just violence in general and abuse in general. And I thought it would be important to kind of highlight the cycle of abuse when we're talking about what is interpersonal violence. So usually the cycle begins with the tension builds where when the abuser creates tension in the survivor's stress tends to raise. There's an incident that occurs. The abuser lashes out through physical, verbal, psychological, or sexual abuse tactics to dominate the survivor. Then there's that reconciliation phase where the abuser makes excuses and attempts to apologize for the incident. This is when gaslighting happens, aka nothing happened, right? Then there's the calm. Things seem peaceful and maybe even better than before, but often that doesn't last for long before the cycle starts over again. So it's really important for survivors to get out of the situation and away from the abuser, because if not, then the whole cycle continues. The prevalence of interpersonal violence, we have a lot of statistics here. 1 in 3 women, approximately 30% worldwide, have experienced physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. 38% of all murders are women. Of women are globally committed by intimate partners. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men in the US experience severe intimate partner violence, sexual abuse, or stalking, with impacts such as injury, fearfulness, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the US, equating to over 10 million women and men annually. 15% of all violent crimes in the US are attributed to intimate partner violence. We've got some more here. 44% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 35% of heterosexual women. 25% of transgender and non-binary people experience some form of interpartner violence in their lifetime. And as far as the impact on children and youth, 1 in 5 children are exposed to intimate partner violence per year, with 90% of these children being an eyewitness to the violence itself. Children who witness IPV are at a higher risk of experiencing or perpetrating violence in adulthood. So it's important to raise awareness and take action. Recognizing the prevalence and the impact of interpersonal violence is the first step towards prevention and support. Supporting organizations, advocating for stronger policies, and educating communities is crucial to the combat for interpersonal violence. Then we have some myths and facts. I'm not sure we really need to kind of go over this. I don't want to go over time here, but some of the myths, it can only happen in certain families. Fact, interpersonal violence can happen to anyone regardless of socioeconomic status, race, religion, or gender. It affects people from all walks of life and in every community. So we have some other ones that I'll give you a second here to read. You want to take a look at them. If we're really bad, they would just leave. So that's another thing that we'll talk about a little later in this presentation. Good to go.
Yes, thanks.
The next topic we have is the psychological and emotional impact of interpersonal violence. So interpersonal violence has severe and lasting effects on mental health. Survivors often experience a range of psychological issues, including post-traumatic stress disorder, low self-esteem, anxiety disorders, depression, difficulty in future relationships. I have some of the symptoms that are classified here, but it's important that, you know, in dealing with victims of interpersonal violence, that they break the cycle and begin to heal. And some effective ways of doing that obviously are therapy, participating in support groups, being around other people who have gotten out of those issues themselves and gotten through them. And you know, advocacy services as well. Teaching self-care and boundaries is one of the biggest things we do in counseling for victims of interpersonal violence, the survivors, we call them. By rebuilding self-worth, engaging in enjoyable activities, and learning how to say no in toxic relationships. So that's that. So there's this concept of trauma bonding. I wanted to talk about that as well because it's a psychological attachment that develops between the victim and their abuser, often in abusive and toxic relationships. This bond is fueled by a cycle of abuse that we discussed earlier, intermittent reinforcement and emotional dependency, which makes it extremely difficult for the victim to leave, even when they recognize the harm. So we have ways of, you know, identifying signs of trauma, justifying the abuse, feeling loyal to the abuser, craving validation from the abuser, feeling trapped but unable to leave, experiencing a cycle of highs and lows, isolation from friends and family, and believing that you can fix the abuser. How to break the trauma bond, acknowledging the cycle, recognizing that and with the emotional manipulation and the abuse is the first step. Just like, you know, in Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is to kind of understand that you have a problem, right? Same thing with abuse, is understanding that that's going on, that there is emotional manipulation and that abuse is present. Creating physical and emotional distance is another way to break the trauma bond. Seeking support because you get encouragement and kind of realize what's going on. Trusted friends or, you know, a therapist can help to provide that guidance and validation that's needed. Challenging cognitive distortions. This is one of the biggest things I deal with. Cognitive distortions are part of what we call cognitive behavioral therapy. So those are negative thoughts, unhelpful thoughts that, you know, lead you down you know, usually in cognitive behavioral therapy, we have a triangle. So it's thought, and on the top of the triangle, we have our thoughts, and then we have our emotions, and then we have our behaviors. So being able to, you know, identify that you're experiencing those unhelpful thoughts or distorted thoughts really is important to being able to change emotions and then thus changing behaviors. And, you know, that concept is all interdependent too. If we're able to change our behaviors, we're able to change our emotions and our thoughts. So replacing things with the thought of I need to be with them, or you know, I have a financial tie, or, you know, something like that. Changing it and replacing that thought with a more positive affirmation, like I deserve a safe and loving relationship. So those are the things that, you know, I work on with clients oftentimes. And as rebuilding self-worth is important as well, learning how to engage in activities that boost confidence, self-care and independence is important to breaking the trauma bond. And then preparing for withdrawal symptoms, just like addiction, breaking a trauma bond can bring anxiety, sadness, and cravings. Staying strong throughout this phase is crucial. And then that's why having the support is also very crucial.
Jessica, if I may ask a question. So if someone, you know, friend, family is experiencing abuse and they are still in the denial phase, so to speak, is there any possibility to help them to get out of that cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, a little bit further on in this presentation, I'll answer that question.
Okay,
But there's many ways, you know, being there to support them and, you know, but at the same time, understanding that this is their process and, you know, being there to help, but understanding their boundaries as well is very important. But yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit further. Um,
perfect.
so intergenerational cycle of abuse. This refers to the pattern where violence, neglect, or abuse is passed down from one generation to the next. It means that children who grow up in abusive households are more likely to repeat the experience. Um, so this is kind of how the cycle continues. Modeling behavior. It starts with modeling behavior, seeing things that have happened in their childhood and repeating it in adulthood. Unresolved trauma, childhood abuse often leads to untreated mental health disorders. And then there's that dysfunctional attachment. There's different attachment styles, right, that we develop throughout life. We pick up from, you know, one from our parents, right? But we have different attachment styles with our caregivers, with our parents, with our with our intimate partners, and with other people as well. So there's a secure attachment, which we all strive for, right? That's what healthy relationships are made of. And then there's disorganized, and which is, you know, also called anxious avoidant, and then there's anxious attachments, and then there's avoidant attachments. So these dysfunctional attachment styles are present in children who have been exposed to interpersonal violence. There's also that aspect of low self-esteem and victimization. Substance abuse and coping is often very common. Substance abuse and maladaptive coping mechanisms are also very common. And then you'll see parenting challenges. Survivors of childhood abuse may struggle with nurturing and discipline, either becoming overly harsh or emotionally detached from their own children. So that's how the cycle of abuse perpetuates in, you know, what we call intergenerational. Um, all right, the effects of exposure, long-term effects of childhood exposure to violence are emotional and psychological. There's an impact on relationships. They have a difficulty trusting others, fear of abandonment or rejection, you know, related to those attachment patterns. Development of maladaptive coping mechanisms like substance abuse, always, you know, people-pleasing behaviors, things like that, perfectionism, overachieving, emotional numbness and disassociation. There's also physical health consequences, fatigue, digestive issues, autoimmune issues. And then the effects are also include trauma responses, and, you know, it affects your core beliefs of who you are as a person, or who the world, or how the world is. Like the world is unsafe. It leads to, you know, mental health issues like anxiety, control-seeking behaviors. I have a couple others listed here too, if you want to take a look for a second. All right. And then here I have a little visual of the trauma response, kind of how it affects the brain, and this cool little trauma wheel here. Um, Afterwards, I'll give you some, I have where I got all of these resources from if you ever want to take a look. And then this is the trauma response wheel as well. In counseling, I often use a feelings wheel, which is very similar to this. And, you know, in the middle of the feelings wheel are generally primary emotions that we feel. So in the middle of this wheel, similarly, is, you know, this is the process of, you know, experiencing trauma, right? Is the flight, freeze, fawn, flag, faint, and fight. Um, Coping mechanisms for survivors. In counseling, a lot of the things that I do teach are, you know, emotion regulation skills, grounding techniques, things like breathing exercises. You know, one of my favorite ones is the 5-4-3-2-1, which is you identify your five senses, right? So 5 things you can see, 4 things you can, 4 things you can touch, three things you can hear, 2 things you can smell and one thing you can taste, and kind of just identifying those things is very grounding and distracting in a sense, and getting you away from, whatever it is that's going on. So I teach a lot of grounding techniques like that one in counseling. Rewriting negative core beliefs. So that's similar to those negative thought patterns, and reframing is what we call it. Setting boundaries and enforcing boundaries, being able to learn how to communicate effectively and assertively is important. And processing the trauma in a safe space, feeling safe to be vulnerable and express those emotions is really important for survivors. And is a coping mechanism that is very important for them to learn how to talk about it. Learning how to rebuild trust, and what healthy relationships are. Abuse often damages the survivor's ability to trust others, and it's challenging, but learning how to have a healthy relationship, and understanding that healing is possible is important for survivors. Coping mechanisms also include self-care and body healing. Trauma is stored in the body, and it's constant a sense of tension. So learning how to take care of oneself and kind of, be able to release that tension is really important. And then understanding that healing is not linear, and, accepting that fact. Recovery from abuse is not a straight path. Some days are going to be harder than others, and, there will be setbacks, and that's just part of the process. So recognizing the signs of abuse. Early warning signs include controlling behaviors, lack of respect for boundaries, emotional manipulation, disrespectful communication, unpredictable mood swings and anger issues, isolation from friends and family, a history of unhealthy relationships, disregard for independence, justifying harmful behaviors, and feeling unsafe or constantly on edge. So it's important to recognize as an outsider as well what these early warning signs are, not only in being a victim of abuse, understanding this. And then we have subtle versus overt signs in various types of relationships, in romantic relationships, family relationships, friendships, workplaces, and between parents and children. So, like I said, gaslighting, love bombing, which I believe I put a slide on about love bombing as well. Control, a lot of these things are things that we can see overtly, but some of them, we can't. They're more subtle, and uh, manipulation tactics, really. So here's, if you guys want to take a look for a second, and then we'll move on. Emotional, so there's physical, emotional, and behavioral signs in survivors, right? Different physical indicators include, we can see bruises, cuts, burns, frequent injuries, chronic pain, sleep disturbances, fatigue, weight loss or weight gain. Substance use in survivors is often a coping mechanism, a maladaptive coping mechanism. And then, those signs of, physical behaviors, the flinching, a tense posture, avoiding physical contact. And then emotional indicators, mental health disorders, anxiety, panic attacks, excessive fearfulness, low self-esteem, guilt and shame, emotional numbness, or, disassociating from reality or surroundings. A difficulty trusting others, sudden mood swings, or emotional outbursts are common. And of course, suicidal thoughts and behaviors are often, typical in survivors. Why did I put up with this so long, right? Why I'm not worthy. They're convinced that they don't matter. So there's often many emotional indicators. And then those behavioral indicators as well. Withdrawal from friends and family, being fearful of the partner, avoiding certain people, places, and things, constantly checking in with their abuser, being overly apologetic, or, extreme people-pleasing behaviors. having a difficulty concentrating, experiencing memory problems, things like that. And engaging in the risky self-destructive behaviors like substance abuse or self-harm, reckless driving, which often relates to that low self-worth. And displaying hypervigilance, meaning that they're always on edge or startled, or they have that flinching, intense response. And then defensiveness or fearfulness in response to conflict or criticism is an indicator of signs of abuse. So manipulation tactics, like I mentioned, gaslighting. Often abusers use a variety of manipulation tactics to control, dominate, or manipulate, or maintain power over their victims. These tactics are used to undermine the victim's sense of self-worth, confuse their perception of reality, and keep them in the relationship or situation. There's a lot of common manipulation tactics: gaslighting, coercion, guilt tripping, playing the victim, love bombing, isolation, the silent treatment, withholding affection, blaming and deflecting responsibility, threats, triangulation, projection, minimization, this concept of fog, what we call fear, obligation, and guilt, using intimacy or sex as a weapon, conditional love, and financial control. These are all tactics that are used by abusers to manipulate their victim into feeling responsible for the abuse. That power dynamic in relationships, it keeps the victims emotionally, physically, or psychologically dependent on them, and that's what creates that cycle of abuse. So safe intervention and support. How do we approach victims? That question that Alexandra had earlier. Approaching victims of abuse often requires sensitivity, care, and understanding of their situation. It's best to approach someone you suspect is experiencing abuse without judgment, right? Be there to be the listening ear. Don't maintain their boundaries, right? It's their process. So we want to make sure that we do believe them. We listen without judgment. We respect their choices, validate their feelings, encourage professional help, but not, tell them what to do, right? I think I missed something there. Offer practical support and watch for immediate danger. We don't want to blame them. We don't want to minimize their experience. We don't want to pressure them to make a decision right away, right? We don't want to confront their abuser, because that can make it even worse. And don't share their situation without consent, right? Because sometimes there's a very fine line to abuse. And don't assume that you know what's best. And also don't ignore those red flags that we mentioned earlier. Here's a lot of resources for survivors. It's important for them to be able to feel safe. There's several resources available, from therapy, support groups, to shelters, and on a state level, local level, and even national hotlines that they can reach out to. I have a whole bunch of them here. And if anybody wants to take a screenshot or whatever, legal and advocacy resources. So one of the things that we do when we're working with abuse victims is creating a safety plan for leaving a relationship. Just much like, when I'm working with a client who is suicidal, we'll create a safety plan, and that ensures that they're prepared, right? So number one, preparing for safety, identifying a safe place, packing an emergency bag, and memorizing important contacts is really important. It is when confronted with a crisis situation, you want to be prepared. The second step in creating a safety plan is to plan for a safe exit, including the right time, having transportation, knowing how you're going to get to and from the place of abuse to a safe place, and being able to be cognizant of disabling any tracking devices that the victim may have on them. Turning off their location services on their phone is definitely part of that safety plan. And then after leaving, protecting yourself, communicating discreetly, changing locks, updating personal information, getting legal protection, and seeking support. You know, sometimes that's even going to a shelter, right? Safe intervention support. Bystanders have a very powerful influence and play a very critical role in protecting and stopping violence by recognizing warning signs, intervening safely, and supporting victims. Even small actions can save lives. Um, you know, by recognizing the signs of abuse, and supporting victims, we can help intervene. And you know, I'll go a little bit more into bystander interventions as well, but down here I have listed the 5 Ds: direct, distract, delegate, document, and delay. You know, it's if safe, confront the situation by addressing the perpetuator and supporting the victim, and that's the direct. And distract, we want to interrupt the situation without confrontation, such as spilling a drink or changing the topic. Delegate, get help from someone or authority, security, police, a manager, and something like that. Document, record any details, date, time, location, take videos, if it's safe, just so you can help the abuser, the victim later, the abuse victim later. And delay, if you can't intervene immediately, check in on the victim afterwards and be there to provide your support. So another thing that we'll talk about a little bit later is preventing violence in communities through education and awareness, challenging harmful norms, speaking up for against victim blaming, toxic behavior, and discrimination. And then encouraging community support is advocating for safer public spaces and workplace policies against harassment, which is something that, you know, everybody can do. So just to talk a little bit about what are healthy relationships, characteristics of healthy versus unhealthy relationships, and different red flags to look out for. Healthy relationships involve mutual respect, trust and honesty, open communication, independence, equality, fairness, support, encouragement, being able to resolve conflicts in a healthy way, and consistent effort and affection, whereas unhealthy relationships, you know, are very controlling and possessive. There's no communication. The abuser is often jealous and insecure, disrespectful, manipulative. Gaslighting is very common. There's an unequal power differential in the relationship where one person dominates decision making and holds control. They blame and avoid responsibility, and there's often threats and intimidation. So some of the red flags to look out for is constant criticism or belittling, feeling drained, anxious, or fearful around the abuser. The abuser often pressures into sex, marriage, or other major life decisions, buying a house, like making sure that the victim is stuck, right? Withholding affection as punishment, explosive anger or unpredictable mood swings, and, you know, controlling finances and restricting access to money to also make sure that the victim is stuck. Oops. Oh, I'm going to go back. So characteristics of healthy and unhealthy behaviors. We know what unhealthy and healthy relationships are. What are healthy and unhealthy behaviors? Similar to the relationships, these are things that, you know, we look out for: the communication, the control, the manipulation, jealousy, all those things in unhealthy relationships you want to look out for. And you know, and even in healthy behaviors and unhealthy behaviors and emotional well-being, it's important to be able to set boundaries and respect boundaries, be able to take care of yourself and learn to manage stress, seek help when needed, have a growth mindset that, you know, you're going to get out of this and things will get better, and expressing gratitude and positivity is important. So boundaries, I mentioned boundaries earlier. They're essential for healthy relationships, self-respect, and emotional well-being. They define what's acceptable and how others treat you. and help to create a mutual respect and balance in relationships. Boundaries are important because they protect your emotional and mental well-being. They encourage healthy relationships, improve self-esteem, prevent manipulation and abuse. And it also, boundaries create a safe space for personal growth. How to set boundaries, right? And how to make them effective, being clear and direct, staying consistent, using I statements, expecting and understanding that you can expect some resistance, prioritizing self-care and knowing when to walk away in an unhealthy relationship. Boundaries a lot of the times involve that assertive communication, and like I mentioned, that use of I statements is one of the biggest skills in assertive communication. So what do you do when boundaries are ignored? Kind of, you have to create consequences. You have to repeat and be a broken record and in setting those boundaries. Like if you don't want somebody to touch you, you have to let them know, do not touch me. When boundaries are ignored, know when it's time to seek support and get help and try to get out of the situation and just distance yourself. Another concept that's important in interpersonal violence is understanding the relationship between consent and communication. And both are foundational for healthy, respectful, and fulfilling relationships. Consent and communication ensure that both partners feel safe, valued, and heard in the relationship. So what consent means is freely agreeing to something without pressure, manipulation, or fear. Consent is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Consent is not silence or lack of resistance or, being under the influence of drugs and alcohol. It's not pressure. It's not guilt tripping. And it's not fear-based, right? How to communicate consent. That's the relationship between consent and communication, is being able to speak up when you are not consenting, right? Ask clearly and check in. Respect the response. If a no or hesitation means stop, no pressure, no guilt. Using body language cues, it can communicate consent, right? If somebody looks uncomfortable, it's important for the spouse in a healthy relationship to be able to respond to body language cues. And talking about boundaries and ahead of time is important. Discussing limits, desires, and expectations in relationships. And then reaffirming consent regularly. Just because consent was given once does not mean that it's applied forever, right? So healing and rebuilding trust after abuse involves, support, prioritizing your own, as the victim, prioritizing safety and well-being, processing and releasing the pain through therapy, through journaling, practicing self-compassion. It's a lot of the things that I teach in counseling. Rebuilding trust in yourself. Often abuse damages self-trust, making it hard to trust your own instincts or your own feelings. And then rebuilding trust in others. It's natural to fear being hurt again, because trust is built gradually, right? Learning to set boundaries and expect them to be respected. Taking it slow, observe actions, not just words. Communicating openly and recognizing what healthy versus unhealthy relationships are. And then healing also involves, seeking support and getting professional help, because sometimes it's really hard to do on your own as an abuse victim, is seeking that support and having that growth mindset, right? So another thing that I wanted to talk about was societal and cultural factors. What are cultural norms and beliefs? And how do they significantly shape how abuse is viewed? So some cultural beliefs include gender roles and gender norms, which are how men and women are expected to behave in relationships, and it heavily influences the power dynamic and perceptions of abuse. Often one of the characteristics we talked about earlier was that power imbalance in relationships. That's a sign of abuse, a justification of violence, minimizing victim blame. Some other the cultural attitudes towards family and privacy. In some cultures, there's a strong emphasis on family privacy and preserving family honor, which prevents survivors from seeking help or disclosing abuse. Culture plays a very important role, whether around masculinity and femininity, around, norms around sex and relationships. What are taboos and stigmas in different cultures? That also is important to understand, in abuse victims, it's very common. Religious and spiritual beliefs, right? Pressures to stay in abusive relationships because, I'm Catholic and I don't get divorced, right? Those belief systems are harmful to victims. And the last point I have is the intersectionality and culture. It's essential to understand that culture interacts with other factors such as race, socioeconomic status, immigration status, and disability. These factors can influence how abuse is understood, experienced, and reported. And a little bit more about intersectionality. Intimate partner violence is influenced by a complex interplay of cultural and socioeconomic and personal factors. Understanding how gender roles, socioeconomic status, race, and religion shape interpersonal violence, the dynamics, is crucial for developing effective prevention and intervention strategies. Addressing interpersonal violence requires a comprehensive understanding of these intersecting factors to create supportive environments and effective interventions. Things like gender roles, socioeconomic status, race, religion, and other factors, compounded vulnerabilities, and tailored interventions are very important. So just basically being aware of how all of these affect abuse victims and perpetuator or people who perpetuate abuse. So there's this concept of stigma and victim blaming, a cultural stigma and victim blaming. It's powerful and can prevent survivors from seeking help, finding support, and being able to heal. These factors are often rooted in societal attitudes, and socially. And they minimize the severity of abuse. They shame the victims and even hold them responsible for the violence that they experience. Understanding how these elements play out and how to address them is crucial in creating a supportive environment for survivors. That's just a little bit more about cultural stigma. Systemic issues. So often we have lots of issues in our society, right? The lack of access to resources and support services for victims, economic disparities and financial dependency, structural and systemic discrimination, cultural competency and trust issues and services are a big thing. And the cycle of marginalization and interpersonal violence. There's a big link between poverty and abuse. There's a big link between race and abuse. We talked about earlier gender and abuse. So yeah. And then legal and advocacy topics, something that I think a lot of you are already aware of. I did put, on this slideshow, which I didn't include in the presentation, but it's important to know for victims to understand the steps in filing a restraining order, and what the rights of survivors are. Survivors of interpersonal violence and other forms of abuse have a range of legal rights that aim to protect their safety, dignity, and ability to seek justice. These rights can vary depending on the county, or state, but most protections are universally recognized, especially in the context of domestic violence and sexual assault. So here's all the, all the rights that I'm sure all of you are very aware of: the right to protection and safety, to legal support and advocacy, to support, to seek justice, the right to housing and shelter, the right to financial support, confidentiality, privacy, the right to make decisions about children in custody, the right to work, and the right for education, the right to be free of discrimination. Well, it's important for survivors to understand all these rights. Victim advocacy programs are there to support survivors both legally and emotionally. They're community-based and government-funded organizations that provide free or low-cost assistance to survivors of violence or crime. Victim advocates are trained professionals or volunteers who are there to offer emotional support, legal guidance, and practical assistance. These programs can be found in domestic violence shelters, sexual assault crisis centers, hospitals, and healthcare centers, law enforcement agencies, courthouses, and legal aid organizations. How do victim advocacy programs support survivors in the legal system? They provide information on legal rights and options. They legal accompaniment and court support, right? Safety planning and crisis intervention. They connect survivors to legal assistance and other resources. And they ensure that it's from a trauma-informed approach and survivor-centered approach. So how do victims navigate the system? For survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault, for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking, the criminal justice system can be very, very complex, scary, intimidating, all those emotions, right? That's challenging. Understanding how the system works and what rights and resources are available can help empower survivors to seek justice, ensure safety, and access support. Being able to navigate the criminal justice system is difficult, but survivors do have the rights and protections and support. By understanding the process and seeking advocacy, survivors can gain justice and reclaim their safety. So kind of just to reiterate the legal rights that survivors have within the criminal justice system. The protective order, and how to file a restraining order. It's important to educate survivors on how to do that. What are emergency protective order, temporary restraining orders, and what are permanent orders. Yeah. So prevention and education. I didn't do a lot of the legal because I figured, everyone here knows the legal aspect of victim abuse. So early intervention is very important in cases of abuse, and we discussed earlier the intergenerational cycle of abuse. So that's why early intervention and prevention is so important. It prevents violence before it starts by addressing the root cause. Early intervention teaches healthy relationship skills early on, reduces the acceptance of harmful behaviors like bullying, harassment, and abuse. And it empowers bystanders to intervene safely and creates safer communities by encouraging open conversations about consent and respect. Some prevention strategies in schools are implementing comprehensive education programs like Safe Dates, Love is Respect, Start Strong. And encouraging bystander intervention is very important. Teaching students what the 3Ds of bystander intervention are: direct, distract, delegate. There's the 5. There's more that we had discussed earlier. And establishing safe reporting mechanisms is important to as a prevention strategy, and encouraging parents to kind of teach the children. Prevention strategies in community settings, creating public awareness campaigns, training community leaders and first responders, supporting youth, and supporting those mentorship programs. Strengthening legal and policy protections is very important for early intervention. And measuring the impact of prevention efforts, conducting surveys in schools and communities to assess awareness and attitudes and see what needs to be improved, right? tracking reports of bullying, harassment, and dating violence to measure change and what needs to be done. Encouraging youth to provide feedback so that the educational programs can improve. One of the other things I wanted to talk about was conflict resolution and nonviolent communication skills, which are very important for victims of abuse to be knowledgeable of, being able to set boundaries, like we talked about earlier, being able to have effective communication and assertive communication. So some of the key conflict resolution strategies are to stay calm and manage emotions, use that assertive communication, those I statements, practice active listening skills, finding a common ground, identifying shared goals to work toward a solution. One of the biggest things in counseling is, we've identified that we have a problem, but what is the effective solution going to be? And brainstorming solutions together instead of focusing on just winning an argument is part of conflict resolution. And any healthy relationship, you want to have a problem-solving approach, right? A solution-focused approach. And then know when to take a break in conflicts, stepping away from emotions when emotions are too high and returning to the discussion later. Nonviolent communication is also very important, because violent communication perpetuates abuse, and those behaviors kind of become normalized. So I wrote down here, what are the 4 steps of nonviolent communication? To observe, describe the facts without judgment, to identify feelings, express how you feel, express your needs, share underlying needs and desires in relationships, and then ask for specific doable actions, solutions that can happen, instead of perpetuating negativity. Another thing that's very important for victims of abuse is understanding how to defend themselves and how to be assertive. The role of assertiveness in self-defense. Being assertive is a powerful tool for preventing violence, and being able to express thoughts, feelings, and boundaries clearly. Self-defense training, building physical and mental strength. Self-defense is not just physical, but also it's emotional. It involves awareness, prevention, and physical techniques to escape danger. So the benefits of self-defense and assertiveness are to increase confidence, reduce fear and anxiety, teach boundary setting, encourage self-reliance, and provide a sense of empowerment. Are we running out of time?
Yes, so we do have 1 o'clock. I do know that you have an appointment.
I do. We're pretty much done. The last couple things that I wanted to talk about was bystander intervention, which we kind of discussed earlier. And then supporting survivors. How do we support them by I also talked about that a little bit earlier. I just wanted to go into it a little bit more. Believing and validating their experience, offering emotional and practical support, encouraging professional help, respecting boundaries, and being patient, right? Knowing when to be there, and avoiding re-traumatization. That's also very important. And I'll give you guys this PowerPoint if you want to continue discussing.
That would be
It's
wonderful.
also important for professionals who are helping those survivors to seek self-care of their own, because it is compassion fatigue is very, very common in the field of helping others. Being able to prioritize emotional boundaries, self-care, and peer support when will help in maintaining resilience to help support survivors. So that's it. I know it's a lot of talking. I don't know how most of these presentations are, but I hope that everybody enjoyed. I wanted to give some time for question and answers, but I have to run. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And if you guys have questions, please send them to me via email, and I can answer any questions as far as, you know, advocacy or, you know, how to help victims of abuse.
This was really excellent, Jessica. I really appreciate you. I think I have to contact you to come back to us again, because that was really outstanding. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I know it was very comprehensive. There's a lot of things that I didn't want to leave out, and I wanted to at least touch upon. And I, like I said, I had notes of things that I like. I hate just reading off of the presentation, but my printer wasn't working for some reason, still didn't print. So
well, that's fine. That was really outstanding. I very much appreciate you doing this for us. And just as a information for our other mediators and also for you, if you want to, our next mediation presentation actually comes up on May 15. So just wait for the email and you can sign up. So we are looking forward to that. Thank you everyone for coming. And again, thank you so much, Jessica. That was just awesome.
Malcolm, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. You have a good day.